Welcome to the CX Pod Europe from TTech.
Hello and welcome to the CX Pod Europe from TTech, your CX podcast providing thought leadership and executive insight on customer issues. My name is Mark Hillary. I'm a writer and analyst focused on CX, and I'm your host for this edition. Open banking refers to the use of open APIs to allow banks to connect to each other and third-party developers to build services that can access bank information seamlessly. The European Parliament created their Payment Services Directive in 2015, and the UK government ruled in 2016 that third parties must have simple API access to bank information. And now there's hundreds of organisations using open banking in just the UK alone. Huw Davies is the co-founder and chief commercial officer at Ozone API. Now, Ozone is helping those banks to plug into the open banking standards. He's on the board of advisors of the Emerging Payments Association, and he was previously the ecosystem development director at Open Banking itself. Open Banking is the implementation entity created by the UK government to actually make it happen. So Huw not only helps banks today, but he was part of the team that defined how open banking actually works. So let's go straight to the discussion on open banking with Huw Davies. Okay, great, Huw. Thanks for doing the podcast. It's great to speak to you. And clearly looking at your background on LinkedIn, you've got a real history working in open banking. So I think, just to begin with, could you introduce the concept of, things like PSD2, open banking? When I talk to people about these subjects, sometimes I get blank looks. So if you're talking to someone who doesn't really understand it or has never heard of it, how would you describe the subject?
Yeah, sure. Well, first of all, thanks for the invite, Mark. And it's an interesting one because open banking is often steeped in techno-babble and regulatory speak. And actually, the concept's really simple. It's about customers having much more control over their information and their money. So historically, your bank account sat behind a very, very thick set of walls and a closed vault, quite rightly. The only way you could access your bank account was going into your branch, or more recently, going through all of the security to get to your mobile banking app or your online banking. And in this new world of open banking, it effectively gives customers a little more control over how they can access and use their data and their money. So a very simple example. At Ozone, we're an international company. We've got a number of different bank accounts. It allows us to actually see all of our accounts easily in one place. So use our accounting platform, give permission to connect and see all of our accounts in one place. So we can see the cash flow position, all of the payments coming in and out. And it just makes life an awful lot easier. From a more technical perspective, it is based upon banks implementing sort of very secure and typically standards-based interfaces, so technical interfaces that developers and third parties can plug into. And typically these developers and third parties have to be authorized and regulated. So it isn't just anyone that can connect. They're regulated players, and only with the customer's very, very clear consent can they then access this information and do something for the customer on their behalf, whether it is helping them see all their accounts in one place or one of the many other use cases. And it is being driven by regulation in quite a few places around the world, but also it's happening where regulation isn't in place because it just makes sense to give customers much more control. It's good for banks, it's good for customers, it's good for all of the platforms and developers that can help customers more effectively by integrating and embedding services.
Okay, and if I was trying to explain it, say, to my mother who doesn't use any kind of social media at all, and she's a bit afraid of technology, what does it actually allow the consumer to do that they can't really do right now?
Yeah, so the easiest way of bringing it to life is probably real use cases. I mentioned one just now in terms of from a company's perspective, seeing everything in one place is much easier than poring over all of these different bank statements and manually inputting it into your accounting platform, which you would have had to have done in the old days. Similarly, for customer end consumers actually seeing all your accounts and savings in one place to help make sure you can manage your money to the end of the month or save the excess balance you have in your account. All of these things can be very helpful. One of the really practical examples, though, that can bring it to life for people is we're all very familiar with when you apply for a loan or a mortgage, you're asked to turn up with various copies of monthly statements and all of this information. Now, that's all sitting there in a digital format that's very easily accessible if the right infrastructure is in place. So if you're going through the process of applying for a loan or a mortgage, then it's much easier to click a button and give your consent in a really secure way for that information that's required to help that loan process to be shared on a one-off basis, so you don't have to send in all of these bits of paper. And one of the things that it also does in that scenario, because typically loans were always based on kind of credit reference data, credit bureau scores, which are based on your existing loans. All of a sudden, you can start taking into account your monthly incomings, outgoings, your cash flow. So one, it makes things much, much easier for the customer. It's clicking one button instead of turning up with all of these different statements, but it allows the lenders to make a much better decision because they've got far richer set of information to use. So, I mean, they're just some of the use cases, but there are an awful lot of them. But it's really about kind of embedding a step within a user experience for something the customer's already doing, looking at managing their money or applying for a loan or making a payment, and just making it easier through having a digital interaction rather than sort of bouncing around between different players. So it might be a little bit scary to certain parts of society. So it may not be that everybody's grannies are the first to use it, but there are probably an awful lot of customers who are using it without even knowing they're using it. It's just the pipes that make things work these days.
Okay, and so is Ozone, your company, and your API, is that actually making that interconnection between the banks easier then?
Yeah, so I guess our background, a little bit of history. So myself and the other co-founders of Ozone, we all sort of played a part in leading the delivery of open banking in the UK. UK was one of the first markets to do this in a really big way as a result of a piece of regulation. And myself and Chris and Freddie were part of the leadership team at the UK's open banking implementation entity. I led the development of the ecosystem, and Chris and Freddie led the creation of the technical standards that are used to make this work. And we saw that banks were finding it really hard. It is a complex technical change. There's a lot that banks need to deal with to implement these interfaces in line with these complex standards, to handle all of the complexity around managing this customer consent between the different players, dealing with all of these unknown third parties. Historically, banks go through a really long process before they'll have a relationship with any third party. And here they need to work with all these new fintechs and developers and do all of that with a great developer experience. And we saw banks were finding this hard, very expensive. They weren't necessarily doing a great job. So as the guys that kind of wrote the standards, we said, well, actually, we can deliver a technology platform that just makes this a lot easier. So what we do is we help banks implement these open banking APIs that perform really well and are compliant and conformant to all of the many different standards that are emerging around the world. Because there's quite a complex, fragmented set of standards. So yeah, we help banks put in place the foundations for this to really work, because it's all based on the quality of these interfaces that the banks deliver. And yeah, that's what we do. We help quite a few banks around the world now implement their open banking platform so that this can become more and more of a strategic channel for them.
Okay, and it all sounds very high tech, very much in the kind of fintech territory. So is this really just for the challengers, the fintechs, or are we looking at this applying across all banks?
So this is a fundamental shift in the way that the banking business model works. So banks historically, as I mentioned earlier, to access the bank, you had to go through the bank's own channel. banks are now implementing these developer channels for third parties to build on. This has happened in many other industries. I mean, you look at what Amazon have done with APIs and what Google have done with APIs around things like Google Maps. It's now embedded in so many other services because it's really good. And this is a fundamental step change in how banks serve customers and go to market. So it isn't just for challenger banks and fintechs. This is for all banks. And in some places, it's being driven by regulation. In fact, in the UK, it was the biggest banks that had to implement this first to try and drive more competition and innovation. But around the world, it's banks of all sizes that are implementing these APIs, and frankly, it's much more than a compliance initiative. This is lifeblood for banks. So if banks want their products and services to be useful for customers, they need to provide the flexibility so customers can use the channel that they want to use. In fact, the biggest banks are the ones that have probably got the most to lose and the most to gain if they either do it wrong or do it right. I mean, they have huge volumes of customers who have kind of increasingly digital demands for how they want to use their money and service their accounts. And if they can't support that, customers will vote with their feet. So no, this is for the banking industry as a whole, and it is a huge opportunity for the very big banks, and it is a huge opportunity for the challengers to really build new services and differentiate.
Okay, and from what you're saying, it sounds like a really fundamental shift. But haven't customers always managed in the past? I mean, what is this being driven by customer expectations? Yes, fundamentally it is. Although it's being accelerated and prompted in some places by the regulators saying the industry isn't moving fast enough on its own. But yeah, I mean, it's a good question. So years ago, if I wanted to watch a film, you'd pop down to Blockbusters, get a video out, take it back the next day, and you'd say it works, right? But now, if you've got Netflix and Amazon Prime and everything else in front of you, you'd never want to go back to that world. And I think the same will be the case here. Again, I wouldn't want to go back to having to print out various copies of statements to do a simple online process. Equally, if we think, I mean, so much of our world now is digital and is based in platforms and marketplaces, whether it's an Amazon or within a sort of a big tech marketplace. And services need to be embedded in the places that customers are interacting. So if the only way you can interact with your bank is going to your bank app, which is something people do a lot and they tend to work pretty well, but it's going to limit the potential. Again, if Google Maps was only available via a Google Maps app, not something that was embedded in Strava and Just Eat and Uber and everything else that usually uses location services, it wouldn't be anywhere near as successful. And this is the opportunity for banks to make the products and services available in a way that they can be embedded more effectively in the places that customers are interacting and using them, whether that's making a payment, whether that's sharing their information to get access to a loan or to onboard to a merchant loyalty program or whatever it is. This is about just making the whole thing work more seamlessly. So yeah, a lot of things have worked well. I mean, it did used to work pretty well to key in all of your kind of business transactions into an accounting platform. But again, no one would want to waste their time doing that anymore. So yeah, things work well, but things can and will work better through really good digital interactions. Yeah, I think the Google Maps analogy is a good one, because people see Google Maps all around in many other apps, and they probably never think that, it's an API that makes that possible. You mentioned that you worked with the UK government, defining this standard and building out the ecosystem. So is this something that just works in the UK, or is it European, or, is this taking place around the world?
No, this is absolutely a global phenomenon now. To be honest, it looks a little bit different and is being driven in slightly different ways around the world. But yeah, open banking initiatives are happening on every continent right now. So right across Europe, all banks are having to do this as a result of regulation, PSD2. And there are a number of other markets around the world where regulation is driving this in a big bang way. So Brazil, there's a huge amount going on at the moment with an agenda actually that goes far, far broader. So it's much more of an open finance agenda. So all financial products having to implement these interfaces. So not just your bank accounts, but the ability to share information and see in one place your pensions, your investments, your savings, all of these different things. Similarly, in Mexico, it's coming in Canada. It's rolling out in a number of different markets across the Middle East now. Asia Pacific, there've been a number of different open banking initiatives, often more market-led, and the regulators sort of watching carefully and following up with some sort of light oversight. US, it's been in place for many years, but looks slightly different. So, this is absolutely a global phenomenon. I think the opportunity, though, is over time to do it in an increasingly standardized way globally. So this becomes much more interoperable. So again, if you're building whether it's an accounting platform or a financial management platform or a payment platform, so it becomes much easier to plug into banks in a similar way, whether they're in Europe, Latin America, or Asia Pacific. And at the minute, we've still got quite a fragmentation in standards, and we support all of the standards that are out there to take away that complexity for banks. But that's definitely going to be one of the challenges. If it gets increasingly fragmented, it'll be hard. It's almost if every electrics manufacturer had a different plug socket, life would be an awful lot more difficult. So I think there's one of the global questions is how do you drive much more standardization and interoperability? But now this is absolutely a global phenomenon happening in many markets around the world. And it's inevitable. Again, if banks don't have good platforms for developers and third parties to build on, banks won't be able to innovate quickly enough for their customers. And their customers won't be able to use the services and the platforms that are part of their everyday life. So yeah, it's definitely global. It is absolutely inevitable, but it looks a little bit different by market and geography.
Okay, and is there any kind of inertia here? Because, I'm in Brazil, I've got a few different bank accounts, and nobody's told me how to connect them together. And, when I talk I'm from the UK, when I talk to my friends back in the UK, I haven't heard from any of them that are kind of connecting together their mortgage with their bank account, with their savings. So even though the standards have been out there for a few years now, so is it still kind of early adopters doing this, or when do you think it's going to go mainstream?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and I think there's kind of some nuanced layers to the answer. I guess the first high level bit is actually it's pretty mainstream already. It's just customers might not necessarily know the plumbing that sits underneath it all. But right now the numbers have been growing exponentially for quite a long period. So in the UK, just looking at the 9 biggest banks, there are about 800 million API calls a month happening. The UK implementation entity published some data early in the year around sort of more than 3 million very regular users of services that are based on open banking. There are hundreds of authorized third parties that are able to connect to banks and are delivering services and all sorts of different use cases. So it is very real. It is growing. And I think we'll see similar trends everywhere in the world where this is happening. So it is a really interesting question, though, because I remember back in the UK implementation entity, there was always lots of discussion around things like what's the right approach to customer education and building trust. And I think one of the conclusions was customer experience is really key, and a huge amount of effort went into building a customer experience layer into the open banking standards. So to ensure that banks were implementing these APIs and the processes when a customer grants consent and authorizes access to their account, no unnecessary steps are put in there. What they're being asked to do is laid out very, very clearly. So there was some really good standards and guidelines developed around customer experience. What wasn't done was a big, for example, national education exercise. That's easy with something like chip and pin or contactless to say it will always look like this. You will tap, you will put in a 4-digit pin. But in this world of open banking, what you're really doing is you're putting in foundations that allow innovation. That innovation might look very different if you're giving access to make a loan application a lot easier. The way you'd communicate that is very different than if you're paying your annual tax bill to HMRC, which interestingly, HMRC are now open banking, one of the ways that you can pay your taxes. That's a huge shift. That's almost like when TfL started taking contactless payments for the underground. That's a game changer. But it looks and needs to feel different, and the communication around it is different. Ultimately, open banking it's an infrastructure, it's a technology enabler. What needs to happen is really good customer experience at the top end, and make sure that the participants are thinking really clearly and carefully around how they inform the customers around what it is they're doing. And it does look a little different. So yeah, I think inertia around something new is inevitable. Some good things have been done to put the right foundations in place, and it is scaling. The numbers are significant and becoming increasingly so. But it's hard to put really concrete rules around a platform that's designed for innovation, because you could potentially risk stopping a load of really good stuff if you say it always has to look like this. So I think it's right that the customer experience guidelines are very well defined, but this isn't intended to be something that's completely restrictive. So it can only be used for 1 or 2 limited use cases, because that would kind of defeat the object.
Yeah, that's really interesting. It's really that you're kind of building the plumbing, and then people have got to build stuff on top of it.
Correct.
Yeah, just to wrap up then, we've seen huge kind of wave of digital transformation in banking more generally, and the growth of the fintechs and challengers. Is anything exciting happening in this kind of post-pandemic environment in open banking? What can we sort of expect in the next year or so?
Yeah, I think there's a huge amount to come. In fact, when the pandemic first hit and everyone went into lockdown, and there was obviously a dramatic shift to more digital services, the open banking ecosystem in the UK, and in fact in a number of other countries, really took on the challenge. And there were quite a few businesses that really focused their efforts on how can this be used to help customers that may be in distress or may be suffering, whether that was helping with tools and processes to kind of manage debt with people being on furlough or losing roles, or around access to some of the loan schemes and things like that. So there's a huge amount of focus on how could it be used to help in the pandemic, in the time of the pandemic. But I think the really interesting stuff yet to come. So where open banking has rolled out at scale, like the UK, often it's been driven by regulation, and almost that sets a minimum bar or a start line. It absolutely isn't determining the end point. I think we'll see innovation in a few different areas. I think one will be around payments. So the ability to embed real-time, low-cost account-to-account payments into digital experiences will be a massive game changer. An alternative to the card model. It needs a few additional enhancements to happen. It's a step beyond the regulation, so it'll be more of a commercial space between the banks and the payment platforms. But that's coming. There's no doubt about that. Variable recurring payments is a standard that's being developed to support this. We've already implemented that, and I think we'll see some really exciting stuff happening in payments. I think the other area is, all of a sudden, this creates a new paradigm around identity. So as a customer, you can start, lots of people use things like login with Facebook, but that's not particularly secure in that the information you put into Facebook hasn't been verified. It hasn't gone through the same rigor that a bank would go through in confirming you are who you say you are when you open an account. So all of a sudden, there's this infrastructure where, whether it's merchants and a loyalty program or buying an airline ticket, all of a sudden you can say, click a button and I can share some information that really does confirm I am who I say I am. And that's been validated by my bank. And I think that could get really interesting. So a lot of opportunity for much more embedded intelligent payments, but also customers to share data in a really frictionless way that unlocks a lot of new doors for them in terms of onboarding experiences, merchant experiences, buying tickets, whatever it is. I think, there's a huge amount of potential, and it's about this going beyond just those minimum regulations. And I think we'll see that in the next 12, certainly 18 months.
Right, Huw, that's a great oversight. Thanks very much.
No, you're welcome.
Thanks for listening to the CX Pod Europe. That's all we've got time for today. Please check tech.com/EMEA/CXPod for other episodes of the podcast. Thank you for listening, and goodbye until the next episode.